Good evening, everybody, and welcome to an RSBJ talk where the speakers are, although one is based in Sydney, where I'll be speaking from, and our moderator is based in Beijing, but is today speaking from Singapore. Before I start the event, can I just run through our usual housekeeping points? Everyone in the meeting, except the speakers, will remain muted. The event will be recorded. And as usual, questions, we hope you will have a lot. Please post them in the chat function of Zoom, addressed to everyone, so that our moderator can pick them up and then pose them to the speaker. I'll start by introducing our moderator, Professor Cao from Beida. He has a speciality of talking about Chinese people in India, but tonight he is moderating the talk with his colleague in many matters and research, Andres. So if I may, Professor Cao, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alan. And good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Royal Aesthetic Society Beijing. And thank you for joining us tonight. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Andrew Rodriguez, who is a senior lecturer in modern Chinese history at the University of Sydney. He received his PhD from the University of Oxford and is the author of Frontier Fieldwork, Building a Nation in China's Borderlands from 1919 to 1945, published by University of British Columbia Press 4 years ago, 2022. His work has reshaped how we understand China's borderlands by thoroughly grounding infrastructure expertise and knowledge in moments of state-making and crisis. So tonight's talk is a lifeline for China, building wartime collectivity along the Burma Road from 1938 to 1942. Which examines the Burma Road as a critical corridor of survival during the War of Resistance, illuminating how wartime logistics, transnational connection, and frontier landscapes were mobilized under extreme pressure. It also speaks directly to the broader questions of mobility, sovereignty, and making a modern China under wartime conditions. So we are very much looking forward to Professor Andrew's presentation and the discussion that will follow. So please join me, welcome him. So it's yours.
So good evening, everyone from Sydney, actually from the Blue Mountains. Maybe some of you are familiar with that part of the area, an hour and a half away from Sydney. I first of all want to thank everyone at the Royal Asian Society of Beijing, particularly Alan and Melinda, for inviting me to take part in this seminar. And thanks to everyone who has decided to attend and listen to this modest proposal, really, of a talk, which is very much in its initial stages. Now, just to put a bit of a context of my research, as Ian was mentioning early on, I have been working on Borderlands actually ever since my PhD when I was at Oxford University, mostly on Western Sichuan, and because, owing to various circumstances, my research is now taking me literally down the road, down to Yunnan and down to the Burma Road, which is the focus of my new research project. And this initial talk that I'm giving about this project draws upon a number of archives that I've been working on over the last couple of 2 years, really, from the British Library, from the Imperial War Museum, from the Quaker archives, actually, as a matter of fact, National Library of Australia, among others. And what I've yet really is kind of my list, of course, is a research trip to China, which I hope to do between next year and the following year. I first want to start by thinking about this topic in terms of methodology as a historian, because it very much starts with what we might think is a simple question, which is, how do we write the history of a road, right? Do we focus on the road in terms of its endpoints? Do we focus on the process of the construction of the road, with obviously its many economic and social implications? Or perhaps what I'm very much interested in for this project is the issue of connectivity. What is it about these roads? Where do they take us? And what are the implications for the regions or the spaces that they are in which they connect points A to B, X to Z? And of course, most importantly, once you have these various points connecting with each other, how does life change in these roads? And could we argue that despite a lot of what I'll be talking about is cast within stories of nation building, heroic resistance, of wartime stories, there's something about how roads can take a life of their own, with their own rules, local dynamics, amidst these greater stories and narratives of nation and state building. And one way to think about, I guess, the local and the global is by starting off with this photograph, which actually Yin and I were just having a very brief chat about this image before we got this talk started. This is a photograph from 1942 by, if not mistaken, American war correspondent George Roger. We're not told exactly where this picture is taken. I believe the caption referred to somewhere very, very vague, somewhere on the border area between China and Burma. Not particularly helpful. Other than, of course, if you would zoom in those images, in those signs, you might find a few clues about where this might be. But the whole point about this signpost with all these various indications of places and obviously notices is saying something about how space is being transformed. That you have these signs in both English and Chinese placed in an area where we're not even aware whether local inhabitants can make any sense about what these signs are about. If we zoom in even closer to these signs, we get a sense that they're referring to accommodation, referring to perhaps guest quarters, they're referring to places where we can repair our tires for various vehicles. All this is indication of the changes that are taking place in this area between China and Burma. It's also, I think, given this emphasis on transience, about people, accommodating people, but also vehicle movement, that this is also a space of militarization, a space where not only vehicles are moving, but also goods involved, which are also moving from one place to another, which are key to, to what I would argue, the survival of China for this period. So this is what I want to try to take people through today, get a sense about how is it that this road that became known, among other things, as a lifeline for China, how can we see it having this impact on both a local, national, but also international level as well. So in a nutshell, what was the Burma Road? And one thing I've learned as I've made this presentation a few times already is a very important disclaimer, which perhaps is more relevant to an Australian public. So when I talk about the Burma Road, I am not talking about the Burma-Thai Railway, which is what people, in Australia at least, tend to assume that is what I'm talking about. Now, there are similarities, of course, in that they refer to wartime infrastructure. They refer to, obviously, the use of labor, which could be either drafted or forced recruitment of labor as well. And, of course, that they serve military purposes. But, of course, the Burma Road that I'm talking about, of course, is a road that has to do with connecting geographically British Burma, which, of course, at this time is still part of the British Empire, and the Republic of China, still in hands, or at least parts of it, at least in this period, in the hands of the Kuomintang. Now, what exactly was the purpose of this road? How did it emerge? We know that it emerges as early as 1938. It was, put simply, a response to the invasion of Japanese troops in July of 1937, because upon the invasion, the Japanese very quickly set up a maritime blockade, which seals off China's vital and traditional maritime connections on its eastern coast. We know that, of course, some areas hold out longer than others, particularly Shanghai, which is known as obviously we know the Gudao, the orphan, the lonely island, so to speak, up until the end of 1941. But in many ways, what is important to emphasize here, that it is the wartime movement, the invasion, the displacement, of course, of the Kuomintang regime into the interior that lays the basis for the necessity to set up this road. Now, this road is inaugurated, I say, in towards mid mid-end 1938. It is approximately around 1,152 kilometers long. And most importantly, echoing the title of this talk, it provides a lifeline. In Chinese, we talk about the 生命线, a lifeline of supplies that is supplying wartime material between the allies of China, which of course have not been formalized before 1942. And of course, it is supplying China and its base of resistance in the southwest region up until 1942. And that's why this presentation very much only talks about that period between 1938 until 1942. Once we have Pearl Harbor, once we have the takeover of Hong Kong and the invasion of the Japanese troops into Southeast Asia, that is a new chapter of the Burma Road, which becomes a different road, which later becomes known as the Lido or the Silver Road, inaugurated in 1945. Now, if you look at this map here, we talk about the Burma Road, and it's all about, as I say, where does the road begin and end? And of course, we could argue that when we think about connectivity, many of these supplies are coming in as far as Europe. We know that British cargo ships, or sometimes Russian or Soviet ones, will be picking up materials in Odessa. They will make their way to Rangoon or Yangon, as you can see here in the map, one of the important ports of British Burma. There's the use of the railway line up until this city or the town of Lashio, which you can see there in the map in northern Shan states. And it is from Lashio onwards, making its way to northern Burma, across the border into China, to Yunnan, where we see the beginning of the building of this road, which will connect these very small border towns such as Wanding, Mangshi, Xiaguan, up and among others, all the way into Kunming and beyond, because of course the whole point of the road is to connect these wartime supplies into Yunnan and making its way into the other areas that are not occupied yet of China, such as of course Chongqing, but also areas in Guilin as well. Now, one of the things that intrigued me about this project is that this name, the Burma Road, does sound rather informal, at times also familiar, and a lot of people may have heard about the name of this road. But one thing that I've gathered from looking at the various documents, that the road itself the name itself was not set in stone. And I think it's important to look at the various variations that existed about what name was given to this channel of communication. And I think what it tells us is that there's something about a nuanced understanding of geography and also the flow of goods, right? Was this a road that was very much a one-way transit, or is it a road that, when you think about that, is going back and forth between Burma and China? So it's easier probably to start with the actual Chinese name, Dianmian Gonglu, which is very specific, I think, in referring to a specific area of China, of course, the province of Yunnan, and its connection to Burma. Now, when we look at, I guess, documents pertaining to British or American authorities, we have a bit more of a difference here. There's a reference to not just a road, it's actually referred to as a highway, which has other implications in terms of at least the aspiration, in terms of the type of vehicle that would be used on this road, the amount of goods that was going to be obviously mobilized as well. There's more, I guess, of the national understanding of a road connecting China to Burma and obviously to other parts of the world as well. In more informal documentation that, for example, I saw 2 years ago in the British Library, in the Burma office records, many British officials just refer to it as the China Road. Now, this is very interesting because here the implication that this is very much a road that serves China. This is a road that is very much obeying to the needs of China. Hence, we get this informal title appended to this road of transportation. But one term that, again, I've already announced at the beginning of this talk is the idea that we see also in political speeches, also in the press, that the Burma Road is a lifeline for China, right? The 生命线. And this is, I think, a very important part of this talk because it's suggestive of the Burma Road being a vital artery to keep China alive. And if I'm sounding dramatic, well, yes, that's the whole point. The whole point is that this road is able to create a sense of great suspense, drama, that is very helpful for the Chinese authorities to convey a message to the world that the fate of China is at stake in the light of the invasion of Japan, and that the Burma Road very much holds the fate of China in its hands. So when we think about the China-Burma Road and its dramatic elements, I guess I'm going to go quickly through just a few of the images that you would find in a lot of the press at the time, at least in the Western media, particularly Great Britain and America. First of all, it's very clear to me that the Burma Road catches the attention of the world due to the sheer magnitude of the work involved in its building. Because, when we think about the geography involved and these mountains, it just seems that it's an impossible task. These are impossible geographical barriers, and that very much adds a lot to the story. It's a very compelling story that China is able to go against all odds to get this road built, right? And one image here, very classical image, just shows you that sheer landscape of mountains being carved out, allowing these trucks to go into these regions and able to carry this vital material for China. Now, the road, of course, is not just about the vehicles, about the construction of the road itself. Labor is as important here as well. And one thing that, that very much builds into the Chinese propaganda of the Kuomintang state is that this is a road that is able to mobilize. Now, take this with a pinch of salt, the hearts and minds of the Chinese masses to help construct this road. At this early stage, there's very little mechanization, very little use of machinery in the construction of the road. We know that hundreds, not thousands, of workers, Yin was mentioning at the beginning of the talk, yes, the use of coolie labor. My understanding is that given the geographical location as well, we're looking at the use of ethnic minorities, who, of course, at this point have very little understanding of or notion of what China as a nation actually is, at least not all of them. And one particular group, the Daizu, are very much hit by the demand for recruitment of labor and are forced. And of course, as you probably gather from these images, it's actually a lot of female labor, but also infant labor as well. So a lot of these images, which on the one hand is actually very dramatic, but also terrifying in terms of the human costs involved as well. And this is not exclusive to the Burma Road. When we look at the accounts taking place in northwest China, which is one of the other arteries that I will briefly discuss today, we know that local population was also drafted into labor, mostly peasant population, to take part in the construction of the road as well. Now, the second point that I want to make here is that, yes, it catches the attention of the world in terms of the sheer magnitude of what the construction meant, but it also has to do with playing a key role in building a narrative of sympathy for the struggle of China against Japan, okay? And this is where one thing that is very interesting to me is that when you look deep into the press, media coverage, but also the sheer number of publications in English about the Burma Road, you will find again and again, year after year, travelogues being published by many journalists or just simply adventurers, travelers, missionaries, all of them giving a glimpse of what is happening in this particular part of the world. Basically, I would argue, there's a lot of, this story sells well. It's a compelling story, not only in terms of garnering the sympathy of countries that have no sympathy for Japan, of course, and obviously help build a sympathy and rapport towards the people of China. But also, it's a story that is compelling in its own right because of the adventure involved as well. Now, this is just one example of Robert Slater, Guns Through Arcady, Burma and the Burma Road, I think probably published in 1942. And they actually become templates of how the story goes. The arrival, either entrance through Rangoon, up making their way to northern Burma, or a lot of these travelers will begin in Chongqing and make their way down the road as well. And the stories are very similar in terms of the dangers involved, the perils, the bombing of the Japanese Air Force, and so forth. One other example, which is very interesting, is, of course, cinema. And if anyone has a spare time, has the time to kill, you may be interested in watching on YouTube. You can watch it for free. One movie called A Yank on the Burma Road. Now, this movie was released in January of 1942. Now, that was perfect timing, given the events of December in Pearl Harbor in 1941. It wasn't obviously scheduled to coincide with Pearl Harbor, of course, but what it's telling us is that already by 1941, and I'm sure a lot of people already know this already, there was a growing sympathy, particularly among American Christians, of course, particularly through, I guess, the work of Song Mei-ling. And this movie in particular takes us through the story of this Yank, this American adventurer who is basically commissioned by the Chinese government to help accompany a convoy of trucks taking supplies from San Francisco all the way to Chongqing, going on the Burma Road. As with any of these movies, you don't see in this poster any Chinese people. It's mostly about the story of an American, but you can see, the truck exploding, the road, the Air Force. All this builds into this adventure, which again is very compelling at this time. And what I found, interesting as well, is that the squiggly lines, that we again and again see in the press, conveying the sheer, geography, I guess, insanity of what the road symbolized, the difficulty of constructing a road there. We see this echoed in this map on the right there. Now, if you look carefully, this is from obviously a Google map. You may be surprised that it says Burma Road, but you might be even more surprised to hear that this road actually is only 2 hours away from where I live in Australia. And the reason it was called Burma Road, I guess, is because of that squiggliness that was very much etched in the minds of people at the time in 1940s, 50s, and 60s. This very much was part of a housing development that was built in the late 50s. And again, it says how the legend of the Burma Road continued to echo at the time as well. Now, I don't want people to think that the Burma Road is unique, that it emerges out of a void, and that it was an adventure and a unique piece of infrastructure in its own right. One thing that I think a lot of scholars that we work on China, we always try to push for that bigger picture, that global picture. And I've identified, among many others, two global trends that I think help us understand the emergence of the Burma Road, which, as I said, is already in function, at least in its early stages in 1938. First of all, I think, is putting the Burma Road in the context of economic warfare. The idea that, just citing here the historian Nicholas Mulder, who talks in his book, The Economic Weapon, he talks about economic sanctions, but also blockades. Well, this is a story very much about economic warfare. The fact that the Japanese will go to great lengths to impose a blockade that restricts the movement of Chinese goods out into the world, but also supplying China with goods and obviously weapons as well through its east coast, is telling us about how blockades are reshaping trade and war at this time during the early days of World War II. Now, this, of course, is a trend that had already begun in World War I. Not going into any more details, of course, but by this point in the late 30s, blockades are reshaping trade routes in Europe, Asia, particularly in the British Empire. Particularly, of course, there's an impact for British India and Burma. And this is what comes up, at least in the discussions in colonial records, about, for those in the British Empire, thinking about how we deal with this blockade, how the Burma Road may also be helpful in that respect as well. The second point is wartime infrastructure. Burma Road, I think, does fit in with certain caveats, of course, as an example of wartime infrastructure, meaning infrastructure built for specific military needs. Now, this is important because you could argue that when a state, a government, has decided to build a road that will go from X to Y, it's thinking about I guess, economic benefits, obviously social benefits as well, but economic benefits, of course, are very important. Wartime infrastructure doesn't really care that much about the cost, right? There's no cost benefit ratio involved because really the most important aim is that of winning the war. So in many ways, the Burma Road fits in this category. I've already talked about the Burma-Thai Railway, as an example of this type of infrastructure, but maybe much less known to people, perhaps I'm just assuming, in the Zoom room today, is the example of the Alaska Highway. Now, this is a highway built by the U.S. Army Corps in 1942, so similar time period, and it was built to create a military supply going through Canada all the way to Alaska. Now, as you probably gathered, there's very little population in this part, but it's basically catering to the military needs of the United States at this time. And of course, what I see as a parallel between the Alaska Highway and the Burma Road is the speculation as to what might these roads, maybe at the time, not delivering economic benefits, but maybe in a post-war scenario, they may be well able to deliver this. And the Alaska Road, the Alaska Highway, one interesting speculation was that maybe it would bring a change in new global air routes, creating a northwest passage between the Americas and Asia. That was just an example of that speculation. So it's very much what's going on in the discussions on the Burma Road as well. Now, I've talked about the global, but the domestic and national also matters as well. And one thing that we need to keep in mind is that roads in modern China are very important. Infrastructure is very important seen as a key to unifying China prior to the beginning of World War II. One of the things that the Kuomintang, I remember from textbooks I would have read in high school, one of the things that was acknowledged that the Kuomintang had delivered in terms of building roads. And this again becomes even more important than railways as we go into 1930s and early 1940s. And two key points I would want to quickly refer to here is that one, the Kuomintang saw roads as important military corridors, which were helpful, for example, to help eliminate the CCP during the Long March, but also, of course, a tool of unification and public spectacle. And one example, which is already showing us how areas like Yunnan are connected with Nanjing, is the construction of the Nanjing-Kunming Highway in 1936. And this was accompanied by, a massive press coverage, where a huge entourage of journalists, intellectuals, military officials made their way from Nanjing to Kunming, basically announcing to China, the benefits of this unification. I think I'm just very cautious in the way of time, so I may have to skip some of my slides. But one thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of the Burma Road is that China already was aware that it had to have a sense of self-reliance when it came to resisting Japan, even prior to 1937. A lot of the wartime discussions or pre-wartime discussions are about that China needs to be independent and autonomous when it comes to wartime connectivity. And one important reminder for today is that when we think about the southwest region of China, which of course during this time is known as the Great Area, the Dahofang, we see a relocation of the capital city, of economic resources, social resources, and of course the war resistance is based in both the southwest and China's northwest. And what you can see in this map as early as 1938 is that we still don't know which road is more important, right? If you notice very carefully here, the trucks that you see on the map are actually making their way from the Soviet Union through Xinjiang all the way to Gansu province and beyond. And this is very much in its early days where the connection between China, the Republic of China, and its allies is more fluid as well. But an important reminder when we think about Burma and Yunnan is that Southwest China, at least in the 20s and 30s, was regarded as this geographical fortress and also a shield, particularly against, ironically, its enemies, which then became friends, which of course were the British. So British imperialism was very much seen as an enemy, and it still was an enemy of sorts, I guess, even during the wartime period. And Southwest China was always part of this paradox. If Southwest China becomes connected with these empires of the French and the British, does China become vulnerable? And as my colleague and friend Yin has shown in one of his recent publications, people in Yunnan were already demonstrating against the construction of train routes connecting Indochina and Yunnan as prior to 1919, prior to the May 4th movement. Now, one final reminder here is that China and Burma, it's not that China and Burma were not connected prior to the Burma Road. This is very important to keep in mind. And this map, which is very interesting, is a map by a very well-known, I think he was a military official and geographer. He wrote this book called A Map of China's Territorial, a History of China's Territorial Losses. And one of the maps he published was about this China and its loss of influence after obviously the Opium Wars and beyond. And Burma here appears as a region that is very much part of that influence, at least of Imperial China, and perhaps was an aspiration of those in power at the time in 1920s, 30s, and 1940s. But the reminder here is that there are important networks that connect Burma and Yunnan for this period. We know we have merchant networks, particularly Muslim and those of the Dai ethnicity. They're connecting Kunming, Yangon, and even Nanjing as well. And as again, Yin is the expert here. There's very much a use of mule tracks rather than actual roadways for vehicle transportation to obviously create these pathways of communication. The Sino-Burmese borderlands, is a very difficult area which is really not in the hands of either the British or Republic of China or Longyun for that matter as well. It has its own local dynamics as well. And of course, there's always this dream of building railways that can connect, India, Northeast India, Burma, and Yunnan. And of course, there are railways already that do connect these areas, particularly French Indochina and Yunnan for this period as well. But that dream is very important to consider as well. And of course, this is an area that is fraught with disputes about boundaries as well. So one interesting narrative that begins to be emphasized by the Kuomintang authorities is because of this relocation and of this new sense of connectivity with other parts of the world, is that now that we've lost Shanghai, now that we've lost the eastern coast, China needs to look elsewhere, okay? And this article that we see in Langyao, published in June 1939, is very telling about this new spin that begins to appear. The article is called China Turns to Continental Doors, and it makes parallels with, for example, the Tang Dynasty, the idea that there is a very important historical connection that China can make, that needs to reconnect with Inner Asia as part of its connection with other parts of the world. Not too dissimilar, I guess, with similar Belt and Road Initiative narratives that emerged in the 21st century as well. But the point here is that Yunnan province and Kunming begin to be seen as a new gateway of connectivity. And again, this map, which again may be misleading, is not about the Burma Road either. It's also telling about how new hubs begin to emerge, particularly Hong Kong, but also Haiphong, which was a very key port in French Indochina, which is able to connect the wartime material, at least part of it, until the Japanese, of course, become very strict about this, that is allowing goods to flow from Haiphong, French Indochina, into Yunnan and later into Kunming as well. But the Burma Road is not only seen as this appealing road that can connect China to Southeast Asia and to other parts of the world for Westerners. It's also important that Chinese intellectuals, reporters, they're also observing what is happening. They're also very much helping this narrative about the importance of why the Burma Road matters for China, not only in terms of that connection to Southeast Asia, but of course connect to the fate of China as well. And some of you, maybe many of you know who Xu Xiaoqian is. Xiaoqian, of course, was a very famous wartime correspondent. He was one of the very few Chinese correspondents who covered the London Blitz during World War II, right? So on his way to Great Britain, he does stop in Burma. He makes his way to the construction of the Burma Road, and he writes this very important article actually in the Da Gong Bao in Hong Kong, published in 1939, and he calls the Burma Road as a road built from flesh and blood, right? And You can obviously recognize those words, flesh and blood, 血肉, in Chinese. And I think when I look at this phrase that Xiao Qian, he knew his audience, because at this point, I think when we look at those narratives in patriotic writings in China, there is this connection between people, the nation, and borders. That is something that, for example, we know that when we look at what is now the Chinese national anthem, right? The 1934 March of the Volunteers, that very well-known phrase, I'll just say it in English here, with our very flesh and blood, let us build our new great wall. So that same idea of flesh and blood also makes its way to this other, in this case, not a wall that is keeping the Japanese invaders out, or at least failed to do so, but in this case, it's a road, built with the Chinese people to obviously connect China to the world. What we see as well is the Burma Road in the narratives is seen, again, this title, this headline here, a link between China and democracy in the Far East. Again, it's a road that connects China, will allow China to survive, not only because of the material, but also because of that connection with the Allies, with basically this world that is now dividing between the fascist and anti-fascist world as well. And one clear idea that I'm working on this project, but still obviously in work in progress, is very interesting to understand that the Burma Road is an example of both a way that nationalism and internationalism collide, right? In which nationalist interests, but also international interests, also try to match each other, but also, clash as well. And I just have an example here with these two images. So on your right, you may be able to decipher that this is a driver's license for a British volunteer. Now, this person here, whose name was Tom Haley, he was actually a volunteer ambulance driver for the Quakers. Now, the Quakers, of course, had the very well-known Friends Ambulance Society, Friends Ambulance Unit. They were very pivotal around the world, sending the volunteers to help, send drivers to help with their ambulances to take medical supplies. They wouldn't take military supplies, medical supplies from Burma into China. And to me, this is kind of the example of how the Burma Road facilitated this mode of internationalism, which was meant to obviously aid the Chinese effort in the war. On your left, we have a very different story to tell. This story, this map is from a book published in 1946 by J.E. Harvey. The book is called British Rule in Burma. And of course, this is another story. This is a story about, we don't want China in Burma. we actually have a problem with the construction of the Burma Road, because what the Burma Road will do is open a gateway. It will flood the gates. I can't think about the expression right now, but it will open the gates for the downpour of Chinese immigrants into Burma. And I guess this map, in a very, naive way, assumes that there's no Chinese influence or presence in Burma. Of course, there was in various cities and towns, as opposed to what we see in French Indochina. And it's true that if you look at the parliamentary discussions in Burma about the Burma Road, the Burmese nationalists are the ones most opposed to its construction, because for two reasons. A, they have no sympathy for the plight of the Chinese, because they see the Chinese as competitors. And two, they are concerned about the ownership of the road, because even in eventual independence of Burma, the road may not actually belong to the Burmese nation. So again, these are also other debates that are very interesting about who actually is the owner of this road for this period and for the post-war as well. And maybe just a few final reflections, because I think, Ian, please let me know when I'm 5 minutes are left. The Burma Road is also an example.
You have 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Thank you very much. I'll just start wrapping up here. These are some of the few leads that I'm looking into in terms of what else the road tells us about the connection between China, Yunnan, other parts of Southeast Asia, and the world. And one example that I found very interesting is that the Bank of China is able to expand its presence in terms of branches. And you can see here in an ad, which I found in the Burma Trade Journal in June of 1941. And what this tells us is that already the Chinese state is able to set up, albeit perhaps very precarious, financial infrastructure into areas of Yunnan, Borderlands, and perhaps other parts of Burma that prior to the war it had no presence or any sign of existence. And this is, of course, an example of how the wartime offered this opportunity for the Chinese state to expand in areas where, of course, its presence was very weak or absent, particularly in the areas of Yunnan, but also, I guess, in other areas of Burma and beyond. And this, of course, as I said, this is still work in progress, but it's already giving us interesting insights into this. I guess other interesting ways to look about trade is the concept that we see a lot in stories of frontiers and borders, the idea of the boom town. So we're looking at the ways in which certain perhaps remote areas, towns, settlements, suddenly because of certain economic trends or movements, they no longer become just simply remote areas, they become connected to other nodes of trade and commerce. And that's an example that we see in the Burmese town of Lashio, which again, as I showed you in the map, it was a starting point or end point of the Burma Road once the train ended its journey from Yangon. And this photo, that's not very clear, is a photograph taken by a British official on tour there. And these are his words. He talks about how Lashio is a new Lashio. It's completely overhauled, transformed. We see the Chinese signs. It becomes one of these border towns, which again, probably very shady as well in terms of smuggling taking place as well. And that's one thing that I just want to make sure to emphasize here, that while I've been talking about the Bank of China, and maybe we could argue there's the presence of the state, I think it's still, to me, not clear how effective the state was in terms, for example, of tax collection or revenue. And my understanding from the very few sources that I've seen and from what colleagues have shared with me is that the amount of smuggling that goes on is a very high one. In fact, one colleague, Felix Birking in Edinburgh, shared with me that when the China Customs tries to tax soldiers making their way back from Burma into Yunnan, all the soldiers do is just pull out their rifles. And of course, no taxes are actually collected or declared. So again, it's very much a space with its own dynamics and own rules, so to speak. I think the clock is probably ticking against me, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up with a few other reflections about what I found in my research. First thing I think is that most of these books that I've found in English, they all have the same image of the trucks making their way into China. Okay, and that to me speaks about whether we need to think about the Burma Road as simply the China Road. Was it really a road talking about the interests of Chinese military and commercial interests? But it's not exactly true, of course. I mean, many people are traveling down the Burma Road, particularly because if we look at this tour book from the Nanyang Yodao from 1941, this map is very helpful in showing us basically this is the new reality of the Republic of China 1941, occupied by the Japanese, although the map doesn't obviously acknowledge that occupation of Japan, but it does acknowledge that to make your way into the Nanyang region, you either go through Indochina, or you can obviously make your way through from Kunming, taking the Burma Road all the way to Yangon, and then of course you can make your way to Singapore and Malaysia as well. And according to this guidebook, this would have taken at least 7 days. And that perhaps may be optimistic given that trucks, were constantly breaking down. And, there's always that unexpected event taking place, be either the bombing of the Japanese or, as I said, simply, drivers that simply don't show up and so forth. So I'm just going to finish on this note, Ian, if I may be allowed to do so, which is this painting by a very famous Chinese, I would say some people describe him as Chinese American, but he was actually born in China. He later then settled in America. Yunji, he paints this beautiful picture in I believe around August, September 1941, called the Burma Road. And I think it was actually on exhibition in Washington in one of the galleries owned by the Smithsonian Institution. And this is a beautiful painting because it seems to kind of give us this hope or aspiration of what the Burma Road was going to eventually do which was to allow American weapons trade, obviously, economic support, with the Lend-Lease that obviously would take place later on, from 1941 1942, but making its way, liberating China from the Japanese. And as you can see from this image, it's the Chinese soldiers pushing out the Japanese. And of course, the Chinese children are very much, gleefully embracing, these various toys that, of course, are reflect that to make, this new technology that's making its way into these regions as well. But as we know, it was just an aspiration because, of course, everything violently changed after the end, after Pearl Harbor and the beginning of the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia. So I'm just going to stop there and allow time for questions. Thank you very much for your patience for my talk.
Great. Excellent, actually. I would say it's a fascinating talk. Thank you, Andres. And this topic just reminds me, you mentioned that, right? I used to write an article about this not Yunnan-Burma Road, but Yunnan-Burma Railway,
That's right.
which had never been finished, right? And this talk just reminds us how complicated of the concept of connectivity is. Because in today's world, especially in today's new liberal world, in China in particular, connectivity is such a very, very positive concept that we have a saying that if you want to get rich, you got to build road first, right? You can be connected first, right? So connectivity is so positive, but this talk just reminds us that, okay, someone might like or prefer being connected, but someone others they don't like to be connected because they have their own concerns, right? So in this case, the Burmese nationalists, they didn't like to be connected even during the war, right? They thought that, well, the Japanese or the Chinese will use this Yunnan-Burma Road to come to Burma. They already have a lot of Indians in Burma at that time. If they have a lot of Chinese come from this road, then Burma will be colonized by not only the British Indians, but also the Chinese. So it will be terrible for them. So they really hate the road. And it reminds me today of this Better Road initiative, that when the Chinese companies come to Burma, they also, encounter this kind of the very similar, resistance from the local Burmese, right? They have their own concerns. We shouldn't say that they're stupid or they don't want to be connected because they're stupid. They are ignorant. But no, I think they have their own concerns to be connected. And it's same for the Chinese. I want to say that, so maybe our audience didn't know, but for quite a long time, that the Chinese actually didn't like this Yunnan-Burma Railway or Yunnan-Burma Road because they thought the British will use this infrastructure to invade Yunnan or China, right? Okay. So Chinese nationalists, even, before the 1930s, even on the eve of the Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese nationalists, they really didn't like this kind of the connectivity because they thought that connectivity is a trick manipulated by imperialists, right? By the British Empire to try to colonize us, right? So it just reminds us that when we are talking about connectivity or infrastructures, right, it's so complicated, and we shouldn't take that for granted that connectivity is always positive thing, right? So thank you so much, and let's come to our audience, and I find that there are a lot of interesting questions for you. So first, I think Lucas, right? Lucas, you have a question for these Malaysian Chinese or overseas Chinese volunteers mobilized to assist with building and maintaining the Burma Road. Do you have any idea or details about their participation in this project?
It's actually quite a well-known topic and has been quite studied. As a matter of fact, there is an excellent book called Diaspora at War by Ernest Coe. And he looks very much at this story, which is fascinating because basically what he's arguing is that we have these overseas Chinese who have never been to mainland China, and they feel that call to go to Yunnan, go to Sichuan, and serve a country that they never lived in. So my understanding is that these volunteers, which of course a very significant number, they're quite well educated, and this is why they have these jobs as drivers, but also mechanics. And I think it points to the weaknesses of Republican China because, yes, you have trucks, but you actually don't have people to drive them. That's because, the use of vehicles in China is a very new thing. It's only really beginning, in the 1930s. So to have that kind of, I guess, skilled manpower is something that is problematic, and again there are many issues about, for example, the use of Indian or Burmese drivers. As a matter of fact, if you look at this picture here that's still on the screen there, the driver doesn't seem to be Chinese. I'm not sure what nationality that person actually is. But what I can say is that yes, these Malayan Chinese volunteers are extremely important. They play a vital role in, as I said, with transportation, mechanization. And the one thing that I found in virtually, though, is that when I was looking at the holdings of the National Museum in Beijing, virtually though, I discovered that they have very few things about the Burma Road, but the one thing they do have, I don't know if it's on exhibition, but it's in their collection, is a wrench that belonged to a Malay Chinese mechanic. Again, a very powerful symbol of this greater unity of what China is, right? Not just the 中国人, but actually the Huaqiao, which is also as important, for this effort and this struggle against Japan.
And I think Lucas had another question. How much of these Burma roads remains or related commemorative infrastructure remains, as so far as you know? What is the PRC's narrative on this Burma Road?
Well, hopefully you can help me out a bit here. My understanding is that some of the parts of the road have actually been paved now with part of this greater highway. I think it's called the G320. I may be mistaken, which connects, I think, Shanghai all the way to Kunming and beyond. But if you do look around, I think people still offer tours that will take you to the older parts that still remain that are actually not used. Look, the narrative is still there because there's still a lot of commemoration, which is not only about the Burma Road. There is, for example, if someone can tell me where, I can remember it. I do remember that there is a statue commemorating the laborers that helped build the road as well. So I think that in terms of class, that the idea of the masses helping the wartime effort, the Burma Road does fit that narrative of the PRC. The other thing to keep in mind, I think, is that not connect directly to the Burma Road, but despite all the, I don't know what the word to use, not hostility, but the difficult relationship between the United States and China nowadays, I think it's very interesting that last year, for the 80th anniversary, there was still a lot of commemoration of the importance of American aid, to China. The Sino Museum in Chongqing and so forth. They still fly in people who are descendants of the flying tigers. So in many ways, that story is still important, for China, for the PRC. So the Burma Road, I think, is very much celebrated in that respect as well. I think it helps, it brushes away all the imperialist labels that I've been discussing and Yin was mentioning as well. And it's very much, I guess, a celebration of China's allies, its common struggle against fascism, but also that connectivity with Southeast Asia, obviously, which of course is very important, a part of this new vision of the BRI as well.
Yeah, and another question from Melinda. And was there something in the psychology, the people or leadership of Yunnan, to make them aspire to be more international, not only in terms of physical infrastructure, such as these roads, but also in terms of the human activity, like this expeditionary force, which ventured outside China's national borders to engage the Japanese?
I think, if I understand your question, Melinda, this is a question about Yunnan and its connection with the world. Look, I'll just give you I'll start with an anecdote, which I always start when I start lecturing students in Australia about my story about China, my connection with China. So my first trip to China was to Yunnan province back in 1993. That was a long time ago. I was a teenager. And one of the reasons I became interested in the region is because when I was in Kunming, I went to a noodle shop. I didn't speak any Chinese at the time, and not that my Chinese is very good anyway nowadays. But at the time, I didn't speak any Chinese. And I remember this old gentleman who came up to me, speaking perfect English, and he said, "Do you have any currency from your own country?" And as a matter of fact, I did. I had I'm from Chile, so I actually, I don't know why, I had a 50 peso coin, gave it to him. We had a chat, and I asked him, "Well, what's your story? Why do you speak English?" He said, "I learned English because when I was a kid, I would hang out with the American pilots in the airfields in Kunming." So this is quite an interesting story that I think historians are now looking into as well. What was that impact of American forces stationed, in Kunming, Chengdu, and the ways that they really brought about this kind of international outlook to these provinces that, for the most part, was quite isolated. Not entirely isolated, because of course there are other ways that we can think about connections with other parts of the world. But clearly, the Flying Tigers, the idea that Chinese soldiers are fighting alongside American soldiers as well, the so-called China, Burma, India theater. All these are aspects that are very much, I think, in your face at the time of Burma and of Yunnan and Kunming in particular as this very internationalized site. But just a reminder that this is not just about the international, the Americans. Remember, thousands of Chinese people from other parts of the eastern coast have made their way into Yunnan and Sichuan as well, right? You have Lianda, what's it called in English? The Southwestern Union University. This agglomeration, of course, you would know well. There's a conglomeration of was it Beida, Tsinghua, and it's really bringing about new ideas of modernity that had not really made its way into Yunnan at the time as well.
Yeah, but one question from Richard, very interesting one. That do you have any ideas or evidence that shows Chinese individuals escaped from, I suppose it's from China to countries like India as refugees?
I think, Yin, that's probably a question for you as the expert on South Asia. But Risha, that's an excellent question. No, I don't have the answer. The one thing I can say is that, but I'll let Yin give you the real answer, because and of course his excellent book on Chinese sojourners in the Raj probably has a lot of answers to that question. But the one thing that is, I think I've used the word impressive and amazing a lot today, but is that Kunming is so well connected as an air hub as well, right? So Chongqing, Kunming, you can fly to all parts of Asia, in the late 30s, early 1940s, including, of course, parts of India as well. But Yin, you probably should have the last say on this question.
But for these Chinese who fly from Kunming to India, they're not refugees. But
of course not.
I always want to write a story, because it's such a fascinating story to write about. Nobody ever write about it, about this refugees during the Japanese, not when the Japanese occupied Malaysia and Burma, right, in early 1942. There are a lot of Chinese, overseas Chinese, they fled, right? They fled to India, but they find different ways, right? But so far as I know, for these Chinese who stay in China, in Yunnan, right, they didn't find any way to fly to India or anywhere, because there's no way there. But for the Chinese Burmese, or the Burmese Chinese, they did. They followed the British and they crossed the Hukang Valley. It's a very dense jungle and a very dangerous mountain area. They followed the British troops. They retreat into Assam. So that is one way. But for the Malaysian Chinese, of course, they cannot cross mountains. They take boats, right? They take ships all the way to sail from Western Malaysia to India. So yeah, of course they find different ways to escape as refugees. So, and another question for you, Andres, is also from Reshef, and I think it's also very interesting, very insightful, I would say. And do you find any Chinese intellectuals, they try to grapple with or modify the concept of Pan-Asianism and free it from its Japanese legacy during the war, I suppose.
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think Pan-Asianism has such a bad rap, right?
Yeah.
with the Japanese, a failed attempt with the East Coast Prosperity Sphere and so forth. And of course, Pan-Asianism has a longer history, I guess, when we look at the writings of Sun Yat-sen, where he also was thinking about ideas of Greater China as well. But I think one answer, I think we should have, is to think about the post-war and the ways in which Chiang Kai-shek and Nehru are already thinking about what's going to happen once this war is over, and once these guys, as in the British, the other imperialists, have left Asia as well. Now, whether we can talk about Pan-Asianism, I don't think so, because I think decolonization was very much about how these emerging nations are trying to really have a say in, who's really going to kind of speak for the continent. And I think Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek, actually, I think it's a fascinating topic, and there's a lot of new scholarship on that. But some people may know Nehru did visit Chongqing. He gave very important speeches. Chiang Kai-shek and Song Mei-ling also traveled to India, if not mistaken, as well. There's a lot of that, fluidity in that relationship, but also that competition. And as early as 1946, 1947, I think Nehru has a much clearer idea that he wants, India to speak for Asia. And, one example, of course, is I think there's a new article on this. I can't remember the name of the scholar. I think his last name is Hao, on the it was called the Asian Relations Conference. I think, Ian, you might know about this. Not organized by the Indian government, but basically it was bringing together these various delegates from Asia to talk about the future of Asia. So basically that is kind of an example of at least a structure of sorts that's trying to bring Asian minds and voices together to speak about what Asia will look like after the war.
Yeah, I agree with you because, so far as I know, because I'm an Indian historian, right? At that time, Indian nationalists, they have much more, passion or interest in promoting the alternative Pan-Asianism rather than the Chinese, because at that the Chinese divided, right, between these nationalists and the communists at that time, preparing for a civil war. So
there's no
if
time.
we are preparing for civil war, of course, there's no time and no resource for you to build a Pan-Asianism, except that you want to, bring some other Asian nations to support your civil war effort. Anyway, so one question from Alan. Is there any actual film of the road, Burma Road? It's instruction or operation film.
Oh, yes. I mean, Alan, go onto YouTube. You'll find the very famous British pate. Newsreels all the time were being made about the road, and you'll see again. It's almost the same story. The windy road, the perilous windy roads, the trucks. Sometimes they show them falling. The Japanese, Mitsubishi Zero, flying over, bombing. So yes, you can find, quite a lot of that footage around. Probably if you go into the National Archives of the United States, there'll be a lot of that as well. One thing I like to do once I do more research actually in China is to find Chinese footage, because my understanding is that, of course, movies were made about the road as well. I just showed you the Yank on the Burma Road, but there are other movies that also talk about the road. I've heard that I'd like to go into as well. But look, you'll be spoiled for choice in terms of the reels that are available, but also the visual imagery as well. And as I said, you can find, I've bought on eBay a lot of these travelogues published in the 1930s and 40s. They're fascinating, and they give us an insight into what it was like, among other people, famous in circles, Ernest Hemingway, and my God, her very, again, partner who was a war correspondent. My God, I should know this. I'll look it up, but it's, what was her name? Margaret. Oh God, the names just left my mind. But again, all these people were on the road because, again, it had that compelling, story to tell. H.G. Wells also, made his way to Burma, went to see the Burma Road, and he actually, sorry, I'm just going off topic here, but H.G. was another example of an avowed internationalist who saw the road as an example of destroying Japanese imperialism, and it was very critical of the Burmese who were opposed it. Anyway, sorry, Alan, I kind of deviated from your original question, but yes, there is a lot of footage out there.
Yeah, thank you. And question from Adam. That have you found the descriptions of the Burma Road in promotional campaigns, fundraising efforts, or volunteer drives used in the church or religious networks in the US or UK? So
that's actually an excellent question. I'm a big fan of missionary archives. I've seen it so that, for example, you'll see missionaries in their newsletters. They will write about their accounts about the Burma Road, because a lot of these newsletters, of course, are meant to reach out for fundraising. So they'll make a point about what is happening on the road, why it's important to support China, and of course added that element. In many ways, maybe I'm being cynical, but missionaries also always thrived on this exotic aspect, right? So when it came to collecting funds, they make big effort to talk about Yunnan, the minorities, the Miao people, as the tribes people, and I think the Burma Road kind of fits into that kind of template of the exotic as well. Now, when it comes to the visual imagery, I'm just thinking about a few posters. For example, in America, you have the United China Relief Fund. The posters I've seen so far are more about, I guess, displacement, orphan Chinese children, displaced women. I guess Burma Road isn't addressed explicitly, but, it's part of that bigger story as well. But for example, I do know that Xiao Qian, the Chinese wartime correspondent, he was because, he was based in the UK in London. I've seen in a few of his speeches that were, that you've seen records in English, he did talk a lot about the Burma Road as a way to, again, get people in the UK to open their pockets to donate funds to support the Chinese effort as well. But actually, that's something that probably requires more exploration. You could probably write a whole article on the Burma Road as a piece of propaganda, in terms of what it's trying to achieve, and what it's kind of conveying as a message for for different actors. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, we have a few questions from Maria too, and I think she was asking that the construction of the Burma Road is this construction of the road an official agreement between the British and the Chinese, or was it a project between two governments? How was this overall management handled? And on the map, which part of the road between Yangon and Kunming was actually newly developed? Which part was already there? And can the road be built nowadays?
That's a brilliant question. There's a lot of issues there. And again, in my understanding is still quite superficial, but there's a few things. First excellent question is, who's paying for this? So I can tell you that the Burmese government is not paying for it. They refuse to do so. It's extremely expensive, infrastructure to finance. So it's really the central power in London, the authorities in London that decide to take up the cost. As I think Ian mentioned in one of his comments, and again, the article I'm referring to is that the road was being built while at the same time finance was being sought to actually build the railway that was going to be built between Burma and China as well. And the only reason this doesn't happen is because the Japanese eventually occupy Burma, and that's the end of the railway project as well. And I guess it's the end of that dream, as far as we know, until the year 2026 as well. So when it came to finance, yes, it's not the colonial authorities, it's the British government from the center, from the metropolis. The Chinese, of course, basically the finance works is that the British will pay for their side, the Chinese will pay for their side of things as well. the in terms of infrastructure that's already in existence, there is a railway, as I say, that connects Yangon to
Yeah.
Lashio.
Kailash.
It's the roads from Lashio onwards that really
Yep.
don't quite exist, that really need to be built. I don't know, Ian, I mean, was there any semblance of a track of sorts? I mean, there was, of course, the mule tracks, but an actual road, may have been built maybe for perhaps almost
So
from scratch.
my understanding is that they don't the British or the Chinese they don't need to build a road in from Yangon to Kunming because they use the railway already existed from Yangon to Nashua. So the real Burma Road is from Nashua all the way to Yunnan. So that's the real
Correct.
either railway or the road can be built from Nashua. Because in Nashua, there's already a railway, so you don't need to build another road. You just use the already existed railway. That's enough, right? Or you can use the shipping because they have the Irrawaddy, so you can use the shipping
Correct.
names, right? It's
Correct.
much easier for us to build a new road. And I think Maria's last question is that can this road be used nowadays? The Burma Road, can this Burma Road be used nowadays?
Well, I think we addressed that earlier. So my understanding, and I think even we had a conversation about it yesterday when we were doing the prep. Some parts of it do exist and are inaccessible. Other parts have been taken over by modern infrastructure, the G3220 and so forth. And I
Yeah.
think, we shouldn't underestimate. I mean, again, I'm just getting memories of my first travels to China in the 90s, because one thing that struck me, I guess, if you think about the 1993, is very much, Gaiga Kaifa, in movement, is that the amount of movement and trade between Burma and China in the 90s is already, ongoing. And I remember I took a train from Guangzhou to Kunming, and I struck up a conversation with a Chinese passenger. He was basically a merchant who had all this Burmese money on him. And basically, he was already part of this entrepreneurial class, you know, moving, between Yunnan, Burma, obviously, on these new highways that begin to be again discussed in the 80s, my understanding, and again making connections with Guangzhou. Anyway, this is just another story of connectivity. I see Alan showing up there. I'm assuming he's going to now shut us down because we're perhaps way over time. Is that right, Alan?
Yeah. But anyway, it's very, very helpful, I think. Your talk, very interesting. That's why we got an extra 15 minutes. So I think we have all the questions being answered. And thank you again, Andres, and for giving us such a very fascinating talk. And thank you, Alan, for organizing this event. So we'll call end to this event. And once again, good evening and
And
bye.
Well,
just
thank you.
Okay, we have,
Before you go, I want to
yeah.
thank also very much Andres and Sayen for a wonderful presentation altogether. Lots of very interesting things came out of it that I hope we'll be able to follow up. And I particularly want to thank somebody who hasn't been mentioned yet, a member of the RASBJ diaspora, Irene Bain in Australia, who put us on to
yes,
this topic and to Andres. So I'm not sure she hasn't tuned in, but Andres, if you ever are in touch with her, please thank her very much from us. We will, of course, thank her too.